I've done a lot of listening this week. In my Cambridge kitchen while cooking, I've listened to the news, to new national leaders, to pundit reactions. I've listened to the translated voices of scared immigrants in Chicago. I've listened to the reflections of friends, heard recordings of bishops at their pulpit. At a Shabbos dinner last week, I listened to the perspective of a hermit philosopher living outside of New Mexico who leaned in to share a little bit about the ecological viewpoint of current events. There is a lot of content coming our way, and it's hard to feel like we have agency in handling it or metabolizing it. The news cycle encourages a particular attention span, or lack of attention span, one that pivots quickly, in which our attention is sort of dragged from one thing to another. This week, too, I treated myself to some listening that reliably stills the mind and focuses the heart. The oratory prowess of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Steeped in the tradition of the Black American Christian preaching tradition, the potency of his sermons are not only in his words, but in the experience really of hearing him deliver his words. So I had the treat of sitting down and I listened to the steady timbre of this pastor's voice as he read the letter out loud that he wrote from a Birmingham jail in April 1963. In this letter, King responds to local clergy who are skeptical of his tactics. They urge him to slow down his protests and instead make change through legal channels. In his letter, he very patiently situates the importance of civil disobedience as a tactic in nonviolent direct action. So to begin, King kind of grapples with this idea of the law. How do we understand the character of the law? When are we bound to follow it or oppose it? He says, and I quote, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. I'll say that again, this is sameness made legal. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, has no part in enacting or devising the law. Legality, he argues, isn't a measure of morality. He cites some examples from history. All the laws that the Nazis carried out were legal. Segregation in this country was legal. Defining justice, one might argue, is a different task, maybe belonging not as much to the human realm as the divine one. So why choose direct action as a way to address these problems? Why do sit-ins and marches rather than negotiations? King says, and I quote again, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. So this tension, in other words, has a holy purpose. To engage with this tension is to engage with a potential for transformation. This tension is something we certainly feel today. We feel it perhaps in our own families, in our communities, in national discourse, maybe in our bodies. So King really knows his Bible. It's like he can almost inhabit our holy texts. And I imagine how he might have read this week's Torah portion, Va'era. In this parasha, Moshe and Aaron come to Pharaoh and demand, in the name of God, to, quote, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. So we all know this story. Pharaoh repeatedly refuses. Pharaoh is the lawmaker of the land, if you will, whose laws king would most certainly classify as unjust. So the 10 plagues began, a genre, so to speak, of direct action. Each plague a divinely orchestrated act of disobedience. However, unlike the movement in which king was a part of, our tradition's direct actions aren't necessarily nonviolent. So, imagine standing before the head of a massive empire, advocating for the liberation of a long oppressed people. I imagine it might have been a bit tense. I imagine, too, that every time they asked and were denied, the tension thickened. Where, however, would the Jewish people be had they not faced this tension? What would it have been like if Moses and Aaron had never fought for the freedom of their people? Where or who would we be today? In our current political climate of polarization, we can easily feel the dangers of extremism and fundamentalism. King, however, directs us to another danger, that of moderation. Famously, he writes, and I somewhat paraphrase, "I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in this stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the KKK, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." And this justice, well, it requires being with tension. This parasha is full of intense moments of listening to God's call, to the Israelites' pleas, with some mixed results. It can be immensely challenging to be called to task, to hear it or to heed it. Debatably, Moshe and Aaron had the enviable clarity of being called by God directly. God told them to speak to Pharaoh so that he may free the children of Israel from his land. They could just follow a clear instruction. In 2025, perhaps it may be challenging to discern the voice that is calling us to task. Amidst political change and environmental disaster, it may be hard to sense that we are indeed called to action. And then it might be hard to understand how to actually face this holy tension. It can be overwhelming. However, we can indeed hear this call loud and clear as foundational to our own Jewish narrative. In Moshe and Aaron's bravery in demanding their people's freedom, we hear the call of a commitment to liberation larger than the individual. We hear a commitment to justice for all. We hear a bone-deep understanding that each person exists in the image of God. Today, we can honor the legacy of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. by hearing this call from where we sit. May we truly listen for it. May it wake us up to lend our hearts and our hands to what is crying out for us. May this ancient voice at the foundation of our tradition remind us that all of us in this room, in this community, in our state, in our country, deserve comfort, deserve safety, and deserve human dignity. May we find the energy and the fortitude in our tradition and in each other to face the tension of this world for the benefit and safety of all. Shabbat shalom.